Not every battle is fought on a battlefield. The hardest wars often happen silently within the human heart. We dive into the internal struggles and the quiet victories that define who we truly are. Click subscribe now and join us for these deeply moving and personal tales.
The call came on a Tuesday morning, and I almost didn't answer it. I was standing in the driveway of my house in Millbrook, New Jersey, watching a gray November sky press down over the tree line, thinking about nothing in particular the way retired men do when their days have lost their shape. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. The number on the screen belonged to Roy Calvert, the plumber I'd hired that morning to fix a slow drain in the utility room. I'd left him inside the house not 40 minutes earlier. I figured he was calling to tell me he needed a part, or that the job was going to cost more than the estimate. I answered on the third ring. "Mr. Hadley," Roy said, and his voice was strange. Low, careful. The voice of a man choosing his words the way you choose your steps on ice. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight." I said, "Sure, go ahead. Is there anybody else in your house right now? Anybody at all?" I told him no. My wife had passed 4 years ago. My daughter had been gone for 7. I lived alone. There was a pause on the line that lasted just long enough to make the hair on my arm stand up. "Mr. Hadley," Roy said, quieter now, "I think you need to come back inside." I was already walking toward the front door before he finished the sentence. I want to go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand what my life looked like before that Tuesday morning. I'm 63 years old. I spent 35 years as a general contractor, built a decent business, raised one child with my wife Dory, and watched that child grow into a woman I was proud of. My daughter Claire was 31 when she disappeared. She had her mother's dark eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness, and a laugh that could fill up a room without any effort at all. She taught elementary school in Parsippany. She coached the girls' softball team in the spring. She had friends who loved her, and students who still sent her cards at Christmas. She also had a husband named Derek Marsh. I never liked Derek. I want to be honest about that because some people who hear this story assume I must have missed the signs, that I was one of those fathers who couldn't see past his own blind spots. But I saw Derek clearly from the first time Claire brought him home. He was the kind of man who smiled too easily and agreed with everything you said, and somehow made you feel, after every conversation, like you'd been handled rather than talked to. He sold commercial real estate. He wore watches that cost more than my first truck. He called me sir in a way that meant the opposite of respect. Claire loved him. That was what mattered, and so I held my tongue and walked her down the aisle on a Saturday in June and told myself I was wrong about him. For a while, I almost believed it. They lived 40 minutes from me, in a house Derek had bought before the wedding. A large house. Too large for 2 people, I always thought. But Derek liked square footage the way some men like trophies. Claire seemed happy enough in those early years. She kept teaching. She kept coaching. She called me every Sunday without fail, and when she called, she sounded like herself. Then Dory got sick. My wife's illness lasted 14 months and took everything we had. I don't mean money, though it took that too. I mean the kind of everything that you don't know you're carrying until it's gone. When Dory died, I was hollowed out in a way that made it hard to track time, hard to notice things I should have noticed. Claire came to the funeral. She stood beside me at the graveside and held my hand and cried in that quiet way she had, where her shoulders shook, but she didn't make a sound. Derek stood 2 steps behind her the whole time, checking his phone. 3 months after Dory died, Claire called me on a Sunday, the way she always did. She sounded tired. She said Derek and she were going through a rough patch. She said she was fine, just needed some time. I told her I was there whenever she needed me. That was the last time I heard her voice. The following Sunday, she didn't call. I phoned her cell and got voicemail. I called the house and Derek answered. He told me Claire had asked him to tell me she needed space, that she was dealing with some things privately and would reach out when she was ready. I asked to speak with her. He said she didn't want to come to the phone. I asked if she was all right. He said she was fine, just processing some grief, that losing her mother had hit her harder than she let on. I wanted to drive over there that night. Something in my gut told me to get in the car and go. but I had just buried my wife, and my judgment felt untrustworthy, and a small voice in the back of my head said I was projecting, reading danger into something that was just a daughter who needed room to breathe. I waited another week, then another. 6 weeks after her last call, I drove to their house. Derek answered the door in a pressed shirt, calm as a Sunday morning. He told me Claire had left him. Said she'd packed a bag and gone to stay with a friend from college. Someone named Melissa who lived in Portland, Oregon. He showed me a text message on his phone, supposedly from Claire's number, saying she needed to start over somewhere new and asking everyone to respect her decision. I asked for Melissa's last name. He said he didn't have it. I asked for Claire's new address. He said she hadn't given him one. I asked why her car was still in the driveway. He said she'd flown. Left the car behind because she wanted a clean break. I filed a missing persons report the next morning. The police did what they could. They looked into it for a while. They found no record of Claire flying anywhere. They found no activity on her bank account after a certain date. They spoke with Derek multiple times, and Derek gave them the same smooth answers he'd given me. And eventually the investigation stalled in that terrible way they do when there's no body and no crime scene and no witnesses. The lead detective told me, not unkindly, that adults had the legal right to disappear if they chose to, and that the evidence suggested Claire had chosen to leave. I never believed it. Not for a single day in 7 years. I kept the missing persons case open. I hired a private investigator twice, 2 different men, both of whom came back with nothing. I drove past Derek's house so many times that my own lawyer told me I was risking a harassment complaint. Derek had moved on, sold the big house, bought a condo in Montclair. He remarried 2 years after Claire vanished. His new wife was younger, blonder, and seemed utterly unaware that she had married a man whose first wife had disappeared without explanation. In the 6th year, something unexpected happened. Dory's mother, my late wife's mother, passed away at 91 and left her estate in a trust. The trust included the house I was living in, which Dory had inherited years earlier, and a sum of money that was modest by some standards and significant by mine. Claire was named as a beneficiary. So was I. The estate lawyer informed Derek, as Claire's legal spouse, since no divorce had ever been filed, that he might have a claim to Claire's portion if she could be declared legally dead. Derek hired a lawyer within the week. That was when I understood. That was the piece I had been missing for 7 years. I understood why Claire had disappeared when she did, 3 months after my wife died, right around the time it became clear that Dory's mother, who was already ill, would not last much longer. Derek had known about the trust. He had known what Claire stood to inherit, and he had done something about it. I just didn't know what. I started watching his patterns. Where he went, when his wife was away. I'm not proud of all of it, but I am a man who built things with his hands for 35 years, and when I decide something needs doing, I find a way to do it. That was how I ended up back in this house. My house. The house I'd lived in for 26 years, with a slow drain in the utility room. I'd been meaning to fix it for months. I finally called Roy Calvert, a plumber my neighbor had recommended. A quiet man in his 50s who showed up on time and didn't talk more than necessary. I showed Roy the utility room in the basement and left him to his work. I went outside to clear my head and make a phone call to the estate lawyer who had left me a message the day before about Derek's legal filing. I was standing in the driveway when my phone buzzed with Roy's number. "Is there anybody else in your house right now?" I was back inside in under a minute. Roy was standing at the bottom of the basement stairs when I came through the door. He was a big man, and he was holding himself very still the way big men do when they are frightened, but don't want to show it. He pointed, without saying a word, at the wall behind the water heater. I had lived in this house for 26 years. I knew every room, every closet, every corner. What I had never noticed, because why would I, was that the wall behind the water heater in the basement utility room was not a wall. It was a door. It was built to look like wall paneling. The seams were tight, the paint was matched perfectly, and unless you were standing at the precise angle Roy had been standing at when he crouched down to look at the drain, you would never see the thin gap along the right edge where the panel met the frame. Roy had heard something on the other side of that wall. He looked at me. I looked at him. I said very quietly. "Call 911. Tell them to send someone now." Roy stepped back and made the call. I stood in front of that panel and I said my daughter's name. For a moment, nothing. Then a sound came through the wall that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was small and hoarse, and it had the quality of something that had been folded up and put away for a very long time. It was a voice that had almost forgotten how to be a voice. It said, "Dad?" I found the latch on the third try. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it, and I am a man who has worked with his hands his whole life, who never shook on a job site no matter what went wrong. The panel swung open, and I was hit by warm, stale air, and I had to grip the door frame to stay upright. The room behind the wall was roughly 10 feet by 12. Derek had framed it out himself, I would learn later, over a period of months before Claire vanished, working on weekends when she was out of the house. He had run a ventilation duct from the HVAC system. He had installed a small bathroom, nothing more than a toilet and a sink, behind a curtain in the corner. He had put in a cot, a lamp on a timer, a mini refrigerator he restocked every few weeks when I was out of the house, which he accessed through a separate exterior entrance I had assumed for years was a sealed crawl space vent. He had a key to my house. He had always had a key to my house, given to him by Claire back when they were first married, and came here for holidays, and I had never thought to change the locks after she disappeared, because, in my mind, the house was still partly hers. Claire was sitting on the edge of the cot when I opened the door. She was thin in a way that made my chest hurt to look at. Her hair was long and unwashed, and she was wearing a sweatshirt I recognized as one of her mother's, old and faded, and too big for her now. She was blinking in the light from the utility room like someone who had forgotten what ordinary light looked like. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I didn't think anyone was ever going to find me." I crossed the room in 3 steps, and I held on to my daughter, and I did not let go. The police arrived 8 minutes after Roy made the call. 2 officers first, then a sergeant, then a detective named Paulson, who took one look at the room and immediately got on her phone and started making the kind of calls that do not stop for several hours. I answered every question they had, twice, and kept my arm around Claire's shoulders while she answered the questions they had for her. She told them everything. Derek had built the room over 14 months. He had told her it was a storage expansion, that he was going to use it for his business files. And because Claire trusted him the way you trust the person you've promised your life to, she hadn't paid close attention to the renovation. When Dory's illness entered its final stage, and it became clear that the inheritance was coming, Derek had changed. He became controlling in ways he'd always been careful to disguise. He monitored her phone. He started coming with her when she visited me. He intercepted her mail. The night she disappeared, he had walked her down to the basement on a pretext, locked her in the room, and told her with a calm that she described as more frightening than any anger that she would stay there until the estate was settled and he had secured his claim to her inheritance. He told her he had already sent the text from her phone to me and to her friends. He told her he had a story prepared for the police. He told her that if she screamed or made noise, he would tell the world she had suffered a mental breakdown, and no one would believe anything she said. She believed him. For 7 years she believed him, because in the early months she had screamed and no one had come, because the room was deep in the basement and the houses in my neighborhood are far apart, because Derek came regularly, always when I was out, and the threat was renewed every time, because hope, when it is kept in a small room long enough, learns to make itself very quiet. There was a period, she told me, around the 3rd year, when she had nearly given up. It was the knowledge, she said, that I was still fighting for her, still keeping the case open, still refusing to let the police close the file, that it kept her holding on. The private investigator I'd hired the second time had come closer than he knew. He had identified a discrepancy in Derek's financial records that pointed toward unusual activity at my address. He had reported it to me as inconclusive. He had not gone back to look harder. I think about that sometimes. The distance between found and not found. How thin it is. Roy the plumber, it turned out, had heard Claire cough. A single, quiet cough through the wall while he was crouched on the floor checking the drain. He had paused, heard nothing more, stood up and called me, because he is the kind of man who trusts what he hears even when it doesn't make immediate sense, and I will be grateful for that for the rest of my life. Detective Paulson arrested Derek Marsh at his office in Montclair at 3:15 that same afternoon. He was in a meeting with a client and did not see it coming. His second wife, to her credit, cooperated fully with investigators once the situation was explained to her. She had known nothing. She was by all accounts as blindsided as anyone. Derek's lawyer tried several things in the months that followed. He argued the room was voluntary, that Claire had agreed to the arrangement. He argued she could have left at any time. He argued there was no physical evidence of force. Every one of those arguments collapsed when investigators found the exterior lock mechanism Derek had installed on the hidden door, operable only from outside the room, a lock that could not be operated from inside by any means. He was charged with unlawful imprisonment, fraud, conspiracy to commit estate fraud, and several additional counts that the prosecutor added as the investigation deepened. At trial, which I attended every single day, he sat at the defense table in his pressed shirts and looked at the jury with the same smooth confidence he had always used on everyone around him, and the jury saw through it in 11 hours. He is currently serving 22 years in a New Jersey state prison. The estate lawyer informed me, 3 months after the verdict, that Derek's claim to Claire's inheritance had been voided, and that the full amount had been dispersed to Claire as originally intended. I want to tell you about where Claire is now, because I think it is the part of the story that matters most, and the part that I find hardest to get through without losing my composure. She spent 6 weeks at a rehabilitation facility after her rescue, not for addiction, but for malnutrition, for the muscle deterioration that comes from years of limited movement, and for the kind of psychological damage that does not show up on any scan, but is visible in the way a person holds themselves, the way they startle at small sounds, the way they stand near exits. She had good doctors and, eventually, a therapist she trusted, a woman who had worked with trauma survivors for 30 years and who told me in our one conversation that Claire was one of the most resilient people she had encountered. She lives 20 minutes from me now, in a small house with a porch and a yard and a dog named Fletcher, who treats every morning like an occasion. She is 41 years old. She went back to school, not to education this time, but to law. She told me she wants to work on wrongful imprisonment cases, on cases where people are confined against their will and the system is slow to respond. She is in her second year of law school, and her professors tell me, when they see me at the event she invites me to, that she is someone to watch. She called me last Sunday. She calls every Sunday without fail now, and since the week she came home, and when she calls, she sounds like herself. She sounds, actually, more like herself than she ever sounded in the years when Derek was in her life, which tells me something about what was being taken from her, even before the room in the basement. We talk about her mother a lot, about the years that were stolen, about Fletcher, the dog, and her class pap professor who assigns too much reading, and the way the leaves look in my backyard in October. We talk about ordinary things, the way fathers and daughters talk, and I treasure every one of those conversations in a way I could not have articulated before I understood what it meant to almost lose them. I have thought a great deal about what I would tell other people who are searching for someone they love, who are being told by various authorities and well-meaning neighbors that their person probably left voluntarily, that adults have the right to disappear, that the evidence doesn't support continuing to look. I would tell them to keep looking. I would tell them to change their locks, because that is something I should have done 7 years earlier and didn't. I would tell them to trust what they know in their bones about the people they love, because I knew in my bones from the first Sunday that Claire didn't call that something was wrong. And the one regret I carry is that I allowed other voices to be louder than that knowledge, even briefly. I would tell them that the distance between found and not found is sometimes nothing more than a plumber crouching on a floor at exactly the right angle, hearing one cough through a wall, and deciding to make a phone call. Roy Calvert has declined every attempt I've made to pay him beyond his original invoice. He fixed the drain, he says, and that's what he was hired to do. He did agree to come to Christmas dinner last year, him and his wife, and he sat at my table and ate Dory's recipes that Claire made from memory and laughed at the stories we told. And when he left, he shook my hand and held it a moment longer than necessary and didn't say anything, which is the right thing to do when there is nothing adequate to say. My daughter is alive. She is 20 minutes away. She calls every Sunday. That is the whole of it. That is everything.